Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome you again to this World Large River and Delta System Source to Sink webinar series. Today, we invite Professor Edward Anthony from the European Center of the Geoscience and Environment Research and Teaching Center to give a talk about his study of the Amazon, Mekong, Irrawaddy, and Niger River, the sediment longshore transport. Before I introduce Edward, I would like to see the next week, the webinars. Next Wednesday, we have Albert Kitchener from University of Colorado. He will talk about the overview, the global sediment flux, the change. Particularly he working on the Himalaya now, the high mountain river derived sediment and the global change and the global warming that change how affected the river sediment flux to the river system. And next Friday, we have Annie from Free University of Berlin. She will talk about the Chile margin, the active margin, the up Andes mountain, the small river derived sediment all the way to those subduction zone. I think it should be a very interesting talk. So please coming back next Wednesday and next Friday. We have two more webinars next week. And Edward is I guess many colleagues know him because he's serving as the chief editor of the Journal of Marine Geology. And he published, more than 130 papers. And also he carried out the research of the global large river system all the way from the South America, like the Amazon, particularly the longshore sediment transport, the mud belt, and also the coast of Western Africa, the Niger River Delta, and also in Mediterranean Sea, English Channel, North Sea, and in Asia also, like the Mekong River Delta. We know he published the scientific report, and also Irrawaddy in Myanmar River Delta. So I think, now I will give to Edward. Edward, now you can share your screen.
Thank you very much, Paul, and many thanks to all of you. Good day to you all, wherever you are, in North America, in Asia, South America, in Europe as well. Paul, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk on longshore transport. I'm having difficulty getting the slides moving, Paul. Is that Paul? Yeah, very good. Okay. So the talk is centered on river deltas and the longshore sediment fluxes, of course, with some examples I'm quite familiar with. That's the case of the Amazon, for instance, the Mekong and the Irrawaddy, and to a lesser extent, of course, the Niger Delta. But these are fairly large deltas, very, very interesting in terms of dichotomy between sand and mud, and of course, the transport processes. So deltas, of course, are an integral part of the S2S system of sediment supply from the continents to the oceans. The development of deltas, of course, is mainly in a cross-shelf progradational frame, as we can see from the red arrow here. But it's very important to insist on the fact that the fate and stability of many of the world's depositional coasts depend on a longshore supply of sediment from the continents. And this sediment exits through estuaries, but especially through deltas, because estuaries are basically mainly sediment traps. So, and of course, overall delta growth and evolution, such as channel switching, avulsion, and the abandonment of lobes, all these aspects are mediated by longshore transport through what can be considered as local balances or imbalances, of course, in the sediment budget. Although all these are part of delta self-organization, including these balances or imbalances. So if we come to the simple Galloway classification, potentially the most significant retention of sediments is in what we call the tide-dominated deltas. I don't like the word tide-dominated too much. I would have preferred strongly tide-influenced deltas. These are, of course, the largest deltas on Earth, because basically you've got a cross-shore movement of sediment within these distributary mouths. whereas the wave-dominated deltas can be susceptible to large sediment losses due to wave-generated longshore transport. Wave-dominated deltas are generally smaller deltas flanked by sandy or gravelly barriers. But here, there are two important considerations we need to bring in. The first, of course, is the preponderance of suspension load in many large deltas. I think this is very, very important. And of course, the transport mechanism. So if we look at data sources on sediment transport, we've got satellite images, of course, increasingly more important, all sorts of satellite image data. We need wave and tide models as well as databases on waves and tides. We need circulation models in the coastal zone as well. And experimental fieldwork at a finer scale is very important as well. I mean, when we look at delta morphodynamics, sometimes a small scale approach can throw light on some of the larger scale patterns. And of course, I think it's very important having empirical knowledge on coastal morphodynamics and sediment transport. So here we've got 3 panels showing examples of the kind of data I've been using in looking at sediment transport. On the left, we've got a 10-year trend in surface SPM concentrations of the Irrawaddy Delta. Gives you an indication of where you've got losses and gains, of course, over the last 10 years. And this is important in terms of looking at the overall sediment flux, the mud flux along this deltaic coast. The central panel shows a number of items. We've got the trajectory of tropical cyclone Nargis in May 2008. We've also got the wave climate. These are all wave data that comes from databases such as the ERA interim hindcast wave database, and of course tidal data as well on the Irrawaddy Delta. And on the right, we've got at a much finer scale this digital elevation model of work done a couple of years ago on the Irrawaddy Delta, showing the high resolution topography. And of course, from this, we can draw conclusions on the sediment patterns, looking at other data sources, such as satellite images and aerial photographs. So if we look at the basic transport system, a longshore transport, notably the suspension load, is accomplished by a large variety of currents. These are synthesized here with the large blue arrow over the shore face. The shore face, of course, is the area just beyond the soft zone. And the transport here, this longshore transport is driven by waves, by wind-forced flows as well, wind stress, upwelling, downwelling, by tidal currents, as well as currents locally generated by temperature and salinity gradients. These currents on over the shore face sometimes entail far-reaching regional transport considerations for fine-grained suspension load, and this generally exceeds wave-driven bedload transport on the beach, in the beach surf zone of deltaic barriers. So very, very important having this large-scale view of flows, generally in the form of plumes along the coast. So we'll be looking at these 4 major deltas with arrows here synthesizing in a very schematic fashion the longshore transport. And we also look at a few examples from several deltas subject to wave influence. Now the Amazon is basically a mud system, dominated by mud, of course, whereas the Mekong and the Irrawaddy they've got a dichotomy. You've got sand, especially in the river mouth areas of both deltas, and then you've got mud along the rest and in the south for the Mekong Delta, and in the east for the Irrawaddy Delta. Whereas the Niger Delta is basically dominated along the shore by massive beach ridge patterns separating the interdistributary mouths. So basically bound by a sandy barrier system. Some of the characteristics of these 4 deltas are given in this simple slide. You can see that in terms of the catchment area, discharge, sediment loads as well, quite big differences between these deltaic systems. What's common among them, of course, is that they're really very large deltas. The Amazon is, of course, the largest delta on Earth. The Mekong is the 3rd largest. We're not sure about the real size of the Mekong Delta. It fluctuates between 40 and 90,000 square kilometers. And the Irrawaddy is 11th in size, and the Niger not far off at 13th in size. So these are fairly large entities we'll be looking at. Well, of course, we're concerned with not with the deltas as entire entities, but with the longshore transport systems that are associated with these deltas. So if we look at the Amazon coast, this is a unique, I would say Amazon influenced coast, of course, because we're really talking about the Guyana's coast here. This is a unique coast because we've got the influence of Amazon mud stretching for 1,500 kilometers from the mud source area at the mouths of the Amazon to the mud terminus, which is the Orinoco Delta. So here we've got a unique example where one large, very, very large delta is supplying mud that actually somewhat ends up in the Orinoco as well. So this is a very interesting scheme. About 20% of the 0.8 to 1 billion tons of mud per annum from the Amazon forms individual mud banks. Now, the transport of mud along this coast is not as a diffuse mud suspensions, but it's really concentrated into a number of mud banks. These are really hypercharged in sediment, very, very thick in sediment, of course, and they migrate along the coast towards the Orinoco. Mud banks are separated by what we call interbank zones. So you can imagine there's a very massive difference between the mud banks, of course, and the interbank zones along shore. And this has very, very serious implications because they're migrating along shore from the Amazon to the Orinoco. These are very strong geomorphic, geological, ecological, and socio-economic impacts, of course, on the Guyana's coast. So there are things that are not very clear as far as the mud bank system is concerned. And this concerns, of course, the area of mud bank formation and the mechanisms of formation. So if we basically look at this simple scheme on the mouth of the Amazon, here we've got the largest river system on Earth with an estuarine turbidity maximum that's way offshore, which is quite unique, actually. It does happen with very, very large river systems, but here it's a permanent feature. You've got this estuarine turbidity maximum offshore, several tens of kilometers offshore. It is fed by hyperpycnal flows, of course, of the mud-charged plumes of the Amazon. And the bulk of this sediment, of course, goes down towards the subaqueous delta, very, very large delta here. And some of this mud, as I said, 20% to 25%, moves alongshore, is trapped within the Amapa coast area. And that's where you've got the mud bank formation processes, which are still very, very elusive. So if we look at the rest of the coast, we've got the ZMBF, which is a zone of mud bank formation. We've got the mud source and the mud terminus. And we've got about 20 to 30 mud banks along the coast here, thickness of up to 5 kilometers, up to 5 meters, sorry, in thickness, based mainly 1.5 to 3 meters thick. Several kilometers, several tens of kilometers long, up to 60 kilometers long, 10 to 20 kilometers wide. So these are really massive mud bodies that are separated. Here you can see these spots along the coast, which correspond to the individual mud banks picked up on MODIS images between 2002 and 2012. And these migrate along shore with the interbank areas between them towards the Orinoco. The whole system, of course, is driven by waves, basically a wave-dominated coast. These are trade wind waves. The bulk of the wave regime is trade winds. We do have swell waves coming in from the North Atlantic, of course. And the regime is quite seasonal. So we've got a very, very seasonal trade wind regime. But overall, of course, what's important here is the scale of mud bank migration along the coast. And each mud bank can contain billions of tons of sediment, which is much more than the annual sediment discharge from the Amazon. So at the bottom here on the right, we've got the number of mud banks from along the individual countries, French Guiana, Suriname, and Guyana, and the spacing and the rates of migration, of course, which are quite variable, basically under 2.5 kilometers, exceptionally, depending on the coastal orientation. This can be quite rapid, 4 kilometers a year, for instance. So this is a very, very interesting field site, but also a very tough field site for experimental work. So there's a lot of work done from remote sensing. Here we're conducting field work on a mud bank in French Guiana. The photograph on the right shows a typical mud bank, being colonized by mangroves. Mangroves are very, very important in terms of rapid colonization. So this is also a coast that's very important in terms of carbon storage, but also carbon release at very, very short time scales. Because the mud banks are being reworked all the time. And as the mud banks are reworked, of course, the mangroves that colonize the mud banks, but which are attached to the coast, of course, get reworked as well. So you get mangrove renewal and mangrove reworking all the time as we rework the sediment stock as well. So what's what's still elusive here is what causes the formation of individual mud banks. We suspect, of course, that there's a very large storage area along the Amapa coast. And of course, the coastal orientation relative to the wind and wave forcing might be a parameter that leads to this storage, massive storage of mud, and with eventual passage of some of this mud towards the Guyana's coast. And once these mud bodies, of course, impinge on the French Guiana coast, then the migration is quite rapid with waves because of the orientation of the waves relative to the shoreline. So this is quite an elusive area. You can see the wave fronts coming here towards the Amapa coast. They're really very, very rapidly dissipated. These wave fronts are from the northeast, and you can actually see the rapid wave dissipation as the waves impinge on the mud stored in the off the Amapa coast here. So we've got a massive mud storage zone, probably related to wave blocking. These are things we need to look at. This one area of research that we intend to work with Brazilian colleagues. And maybe what we think, of course, is that depending on the orientation of the wave field, the seasonal wave field, but also the oceanographic circulation patterns related to meteorological, mesoscale meteorological phenomenon in the Atlantic, there could be spillover, periodic spillover of portions of elongated mud. And once they spill over from this north-south coast towards this northwest-southeast coast, then the wave forcing becomes much more rapid because this elongated mud patches, and they form this elongated mud bank. So probably the morphology is acquired right from the start when they spill over from the Amapa coast. Now, this slide shows a number of characteristics of the mud banks. At a smaller scale, of course, individual mud banks. So you've got the bare mud flat, of course, and you've got mangrove colonized mud. You've got the trailing edge, which is the back side of each mud bank. And of course, you've got the leading edge at the front. The leading edge receives mud being recycled from the trailing edge through waves impinging from the northeast. And the whole system moves alongshore at rates of 1 to 4 kilometers a year. The wave energy is completely dissipated within the mud banks. The dissipation is less, so wave energy actually arrives on the coast in the interbank areas. And of course, these are very, very high concentration, mud concentration features. Basically, the mud concentrations in the interbank areas are lower in the surface waters, but then you've got the shore face there that's charged in mud, and over the shore face, of course, the mud banks advect towards the Orinoco Delta. So this is a simple summary of the dynamics over a mud bank. You've got the trailing edge. At this trailing edge, of course, in the interbank area, you've got shoreline erosion. And then you've got reworking of the mud, which moves to the front towards the leading edge, and the whole system translates alongshore. But given the relatively moderate rate of migration of kilometers a year, mangrove colonization can be extremely rapid. You can have several kilometers, several tens of kilometers of mangrove colonization in just 1 year. So a very, very rapid process. And of course, very, very rapid erosion of the mangrove colonized areas as well. Now, in areas where you've got the higher wave energy in the interbank areas, the mud, of course, is constantly reworked. And in these areas, you can have shoreline deposits that are composed of sand. So you get cheniers, you get beaches being formed in these interbank areas. And as the mud banks move along, of course, these sandy deposits can be isolated over time. And over the Holocene, the last 5,000 years, of course, you've had outbuilding of the young coastal plain of the Guianas, involving attachment of mud alongshore, as shown by especially Allison a few years ago. And of course, within this progradational plain, you've got the cheniers that are built by sand supplied by the local rivers. Mind you, some of these local rivers are quite big as well. If we look at an approximate mud bank budget, of course, we've got about 70 to 100 billion tons at any time in the mud bank system, which is a lot, because that's 70 to 100 times the annual Amazon mud discharge. About 20% of this annual mud discharge from the Amazon goes into the individual mud bank system. These fluctuations in mud budget are shown for the French Guiana coast here, for instance, where we see a loss between 1988 and 2006 of 2 million tons, but the overall budget is quite massive, because to the tune of 35 million tons, 37 million tons. And of course, these very, very massive amounts of mud have a bearing on the stability of the shoreline, because the rates of shoreline change here can be quite massive, sometimes several hundreds of meters a year. So if we look at these two slides, we've got two examples of very recent work on the Suriname side. This is the French Guiana side on the left and the Suriname coast on the right. We've got massive impact of these migrating mud banks on the shore. So you've got these alternations of erosion and accretion along the coast to the tune of what, 200 meters a year sometimes, which is really very, very spectacular. And of course, this plays as well on the mangroves and on the carbon budget of the French Guiana, Suriname, and Guyana coasts here, and of course Venezuela as well. So these are massive shoreline changes, which have very, very important implications in terms of coastal zone management here. Now, the mud bank system also has a significant influence on the numerous river mouths of the Guianas. These are basically Guiana shield rivers that do not supply a lot of mud. They're basically bed load conveyors. They bring in significant amounts of sand onto the coast, which you'd expect for rivers such as the Moroni, so over 60,000 square kilometers in size, in area. And of course, what happens in these river mouths is some of the Amazon mud translating alongshore gets into the river mouths and contributes to sedimentation within these estuaries. So if we look at the Moroni River estuary here, for instance, we've got this panel on the right. You've got this delta actually outbuilding at the Moroni, which is composed of mud from the Amazon and cheniers, massive sand supply from the Moroni estuary. So, and you've got the mud bank there impinging on the mouth of the Moroni. This is very, very recent. It's work that's in press at present. And if you look at the panels on the right, at the top, you've got the mud intrusion within this Amazon mud intrusion within the Moroni system, very, very dense concentrations of mud moving in and out within these estuaries. And some of this is trapped, of course, in long-term outbuild of the coastal plain associated with these estuaries. Another effect, of course, of these mud bank system, of course, is that the river mouths, smaller river mouths, get diverted with the formation of muddy capes colonized by mangroves. So you've got these mud capes diverting some of these smaller rivers. This is the case of the Suriname River, for instance, the Copenhagen River, not the case of the Corentyne, because it's quite a big river, nor the Moroni. But you've got all these effects on the coast. Another effect, of course, of these moving bank and interbank areas, of course, is on beach and the chenier dynamics. The mud banks modify the wave field, they induce changes in the sediment transport and the longshore drift patterns. So you get longshore reversal because you get the mud banks as they impinge on the front of these beaches. Of course, you start getting low wave energy at the leading edge. So you get counter drift rather than the usual drift towards the northwest. So you get longshore drift that can show reversals over the years here between 2000 and 2015. You've got at least two longshore drift reversals. These have an important bearing, of course. This is known as beach rotation. And as far as I know, these are the only known examples on Earth of mud-induced beach rotation. So this is a beach rotation phenomenon that works at scales of several years to what, maybe 1.52 decades, whereas rotation on beaches generally on a morphodynamic basis is associated with seasonal changes in wave energy. So very, very interesting system, with implications, of course, for long-term shoreline management as well. Because if you start building in areas where you've got a lot of accretion, and then 15, 20 years after the sand moves to the other side, you're in trouble. So the longshore passage of mud banks is not a guarantee, of course, against erosion. We've also had areas where, in spite of the passage of mud banks on several occasions, there's been chronic erosion of the coast. So it's very difficult predicting shoreline change on the Guyana's coast, of course. There's no simple model in terms of mud bank induced shoreline accretion, nor interbank shoreline induced erosion at time scales of years to decades. So the system can be very, very unpredictable. Here we've got an example in Western French Guiana, where over 50 to 57 years, you've had massive amount of erosion, very little accretion, and massive mangrove removal as well. 42 square kilometers of mangroves removed in a period of 67 years. That's quite a lot. So with implications, of course, on carbon storage. So if we sum up on the Amazon, how much Amazon mud ends up in the Orinoco system? This is an interesting question, an unanswered question, of course, and this is work for the future as well. This mud actually impinges on the southern sector of the active part of the Orinoco Delta, and some of it certainly goes into onto the delta front and the deep sea fan of the Orinoco. But this is a theme for research as well, knowing actually how much of the Amazon mud ends up in the Orinoco system. So now if we move on to the Mekong Delta, this is a muddy delta, of course, at a large scale, but with a very clear concentration of sandy beach ridges at the mouths area. So you can actually see that there's a fine concentration of sandy deposits here, the work of my friend Toru Tamura in the river mouths area, and that this has been going on for 3,000–4,000 years, so in some cases. You've had the same pattern, fixed river mouths, but then you've got these flared beach ridge patterns that indicate that sand has been concentrated between the interdistributary mouths. Of course, the Mekong is a monsoon influence system in terms of water discharge, but also wave energy. We've got a northeast monsoon in the dry season, which is higher energy waves, and the lower energy southwest monsoon waves. And the panel on the left from Toru Tamura's work shows that we still have ongoing accretion at the mouths, erosion along much of the muddy coast, moving towards the south, towards Kamau Peninsula. Kamau Peninsula is a concentration area for mud being moved alongshore from the north, from the Gulf of Thailand, and along the much of the Mekong, eastern Mekong Delta shoreline as well. So very interesting system of dichotomy between this sand concentration at the mouth and the mud that has been advected towards the south. Now, if we look at a finer scale of research here, this is a beach morphodynamics study on one of these interdistributary mouths. We can actually see that there's sediment moves up and down. You've got drift termini, you've got erosion areas. Basically, the central areas are erosion areas. But if we're in a net progradational framework, we would imagine, of course, that there won't be any erosion here, but there is, because the sand load is actually diminishing in the Mekong Delta. So there's reworking, internal morphodynamics here, a form of very local self-organization. But basically, the message that comes from looking at these beach ridge patterns, of course, and the field work is that we've got sand trapping along the interdistributary plain shorelines. Here we've got these interdistributary plain shorelines. And of course, this trapping is related to these fixed multiple mouths, fixed by strong river jets and tidal pumping. So we end up with multiple sediment cells, but with sequestering of sand within the river mouths area. So the sand doesn't move from this river mouth area because of this strong effect of the river mouths on wave refraction patterns. So if we look at this system here, we've got this erosional area. This is a fine example of erosion at Badong. So the sediment that's being removed from the dune frontier is moved both north and south within the interdistributary plain, but really maintained within this sediment cell. And of course, a longshore transport, which also affects the mud, mind you. It's very important stating this. The longshore transport is very weak in the southwest summer monsoon when we have waves from the southwest, but much stronger during the northeast monsoon. And this, of course, explains the orientation of the Mekong Delta. So at the longer millennial time scale, we've got these beach ridge alignments, very fine, nice flared patterns that show the longshore drift sequences here. And of course, the trapping of sediment within these interdistributary mouths. Whereas the mud has been advected southwestwards by the whole current system, which is related to tides, of course, but also to the northeast monsoon waves and the longshore currents generated by northeast monsoon waves, currents such as those we see in this panel here, FE2. So if we look at this image, of course, it's very, very, very interesting image. During the dry season, the northeast monsoon, or maybe let's start with the wet season, where you get mud coming down to the mouth. There's mud storage at the mouth. It's a mud storage zone. You can actually see that the plume along the shore is much less charged in sediment. This reflects, of course, trapping at the mouths by the southwest monsoon waves. So sediment is concentrated at the mouths. And of course, with the northeast monsoon waves, this sediment is dispersed southwards. But there's also a component of mud that moves within the channels, up channel as well. So, and this seems to become aggravated by channel deepening related to sand mining within the Mekong system. So very, very interesting system of southwestward longshore transport related to the much stronger northeast monsoon waves, some up-channel pumping, but of course, in the southwest monsoon season, there's a lot of trapping at the mouth. So if we anticipate a loss of sediment related to dams, of course, and to sand mining, then deeper channels, more up-channel mining, then we can imagine that the river mouth storage volume of mud here diminishes over time, has diminished over the last couple of decades, probably, related to these perturbations of the sediment budget. And of course, this means, of course, that the amount of mud moving along the coast diminishes. So we need this mud to dissipate wave energy during the northeast monsoon. So if the amount of mud moving along shore towards the southwest is diminishing, then this leads basically to erosion of the shoreline in order for the systems to become recharged in mud as well. So basically, we've got this scheme here of still ongoing erosion at the accretion at the mouths, massive shoreline transport of mud towards the south, a high accretion mud depot center of Kamau, and of course erosion along the Gulf of Thailand coast. So very, very interesting system. If we look at the mechanistic feedbacks involved in fluvial sediment supply, then we can summarize the system as one being the mud supply to the coast is diminishing, so is the sand supply as well, because of the changes in the Mekong system. But the interesting thing here is the deepening of the channels related to massive channel bed mining leads to mud moving up the river mouths in the summer months, northeast summer monsoon season. And that's the time we need this mud along the coast to dissipate wave energy. So if there's less mud moving along the coast, automatically you end up having erosion. And of course, there's a lot of accelerated subsidence on the delta with the canal system as well, as shown by the recent work of Toru Tamura. And this leads to enhanced delta plain mud trapping. So there's less mud going to the south, there's more erosion, but then there's a convergence in the Kamau Point area, and where there's still ongoing accretion. So significant impacts of dams and sand mining on the delta sediment budget, compounded by accelerated subsidence over much of the delta plain. And these are some implications, of course, for the mechanistic processes going on within the delta plain, but also along the shore. Now, if we go on to the Irrawaddy Delta, of course, very, very interesting system, disproportionately large delta relative to the size of the river. Basically, the work we've done, but also the work done by Paul Liu on the Irrawaddy Delta shows that you've got two basic sectors. You've got the western sector, which is dominated by the river mouths, just as in the Mekong, and you've got the muddy sector, which is much less prograded in the towards the east, towards the Gulf of Mataban. And basically, what we have is sand being concentrated at the mouths, but then mud moving towards the east. But we should also take into account the importance of the sediment supply from the Salween River. It tends to be neglected, but it's also an important contributor of mud to this mud depot center, which is found in the east and which is infilling, of course, the embayment we've got here with the smaller Sitong River. Here we've got this monsoon wave regime from the southwest waves, and this, of course, contributes to the flux towards the east, tidal currents as well. And you can actually see that tidal range increases towards the mud depot center, where we get much less sand deposits outcropping along the coast. So if we look at these two modes of coastal longshore sediment transport, we've got these two modes. We've got in the river mouths area, we've got a segmented longshore transport system that's dictated by the distributary mouths. So basically what we have here is a system of containment of the sand that's being brought by these rivers. High discharge during the rainy season, the sand goes onto the beaches and it's dispersed by bidirectional longshore drift. We're moving towards a system where erosion is increasing in these central beach areas. These are becoming erosion hotspots, and this relates, of course, to a drop in sand supply related to massive aggregate mining within the Irrawaddy Delta as well. So this bidirectional transport pattern we also saw in the Mekong is reflected here in the beach ridge patterns over the long term. So this is a system that leads to concentration of sand within the river mouths and very little sand supply towards the lower energy area. Of course, there's a feedback effect because wave energy is higher here as well, and than in the eastern sector. So declining sediment supplies may be impacting the delta shoreline, and this is resulting in change in the longshore patterns of sand reworking in this western sector. We've got large areas of erosion along this river mouths area, which is not usual for a delta. I mean, delta would be expected to be accreting much of the time. So if we look at the system at a finer scale, that's the morphodynamic scale I was talking about, we've got this erosion hotspot in the center of this flanking beach here we've got, which of course is symptomatic of the progradation of beach ridges you've got on this coast. We've got bidirectional drift, of course, and the sediment moves from the narrow central sectors to feed much larger distal portions of the system. But of course, the sediment is contained between this interdistributary mouths. So it's a redistribution process, sort of self-organized at the very local scale with longshore morphological reworking. Yeah. Now, if we look at the mud system is quite different, of course, and this is large-scale mud advection towards the Gulf of Mataban. This is related to the fluxes within the Andaman Sea here, and of course the monsoon, of course, is very, very important. So southwest monsoon waves and wind patterns are very important in this transport. But we've also got the morphology here. We've got an embayed system, low energy system there that's very propitious to trapping mud from the Irrawaddy, as I said, but also from the Salween. There's possibly reworking as well, because we've got very high suspended sediment concentrations in December, for instance, from this image, and which is the dry season. The rainy season goes from June to October, November. But then there's a lag, of course, in outflow from the big rivers. These are big seasonal rivers. So you get still large amounts of sediment being supplied at the end of the rainy season. And all these are moving towards the east, which is the shifting delta in a way, because the progradation at the mouths of the Irrawaddy will be ceasing practically, because we are at the limits of the deltaic protuberance here. We've got bedrock headlands in the west here. So the delta is sort of shifting towards the east. This will depend, of course, on the maintenance of fine sediment supply in these deltaic systems. So if we move on to the Niger Delta, this is quite a different system. It's the mud is contained within back barrier deltaic plains, and you've got massive beach ridges along the Niger Delta, which is a mixed river wave dominated delta exposed to southwest swells from the Atlantic. Swell energy is, of course, higher during the southern hemisphere summer. So you get higher energy waves, but basically the wave energy regime goes from 0.5 to 2 meters a year. So big waves all the time, moderate to big waves all the time, very strong longshore drift. We've got multiple mouths here. This is a well-organized system wherein these multiple mouths are fixed, of course. They maintain their discharge from fluvial water load, but also from tidal influx. And the diagram we've got at the bottom there shows migrating tidal inlets, but these are really very, very rare on the Niger Delta. These are related to very, very small tidally influenced channels. This diagram by Umkens. This migrating tidal system, of course, the tidal inlet system is more typical of barrier islands. It's not the case here. So these inlets are actually fixed, and the fixity of these inlets, of course, has meant that there has been scope for massive trapping of sand between the interdistributary mouths, but also massive beach ridge progradation. So this is basically the system we've got here. And probably the muddy shoreline we've got in the northwest might be related to the fact that the sand supply in this area has not been assured over the last maybe centuries, and the barrier system there has been completely eroded. So strong outbuilding of the beach ridge bound interdistributary plains. This leads to a segmented longshore transport system with these multiple mouths, strong river jets with tidal pumping. And of course, they form individual sediment cells, drift towards the east, on one side of the Niger Delta and towards the north. And we've got here a study by a colleague, young colleague, Olusegun Dada, showing these drift directions, massive amount of sediments moving, sand moving along the coast, either eastward, northwestward, or northwestward, or eastward, depending on the area. So we've got three sectors. We've got the END, eastern sector, we've got the central sector, and we've got the WND, which is the northwestern sector. So, but in spite of this massive amount of sand moving longshore, of course, the whole system maintains itself by trapping sand within this interdistributary plains, so that they prograde, forming these massive beach ridge systems we've got. And of course, you can have short-term changes. The short-term changes can be quite dramatic, as you can see from these figures. Of course, you've got erosion, you've got accretion over short periods of time. These are short-term adjustments, of course, to wave energy changes. But basically, the system traps sediment. It doesn't escape from these interdistributary mouths. And there's some form of solidarity. They're there, they're fixed. So we get wholesale progression in the form of beach ridges. So quite a different system from what we've seen, dominated by sand alongshore. So if we attempt to synthesize what's going on here in morphodynamic terms, we've got, of course, these strong river jets. And if we have we can have strong drift, which is unidirectional, where we've got a wave approach direction that's really oblique to the coast. This is the case of the Niger, for instance. So you get sand moving down. This sand is redistributed one side. But then on the other side, with the Mekong and the Irrawaddy, we've got where there's more refraction of waves on the mouths of the rivers. We've got bidirectional drift at the mouths, and this contributes to trapping sediment between the successive mouths you've got. These are just individual mouths. So if you multiply this effect along the coast, you get this trapping of sand within the mouth. So basically, I'll just talk about the top panels. The bottom panels, of course, are related to weak river jets. These weak river jets can lead to wave rewalking of the river mouth bars and, of course, redistribution of the sand with the same drift directions, bidirectional on one side and unidirectional on the other. Okay, a few notes before ending up the talk. A longshore mud transfer by wind, tide, and wave-forced flows is quite common in large deltas. This is the case, for instance, of the Ganges Brahmaputra, where you've got the survival, of course, the ongoing survival of the Sundarbans is dependent on mud supply from the Meghna system here in the east. This is very important in terms of balancing aspects such as subsidence, but also cyclone erosion and all this in the Sundarbans area, where there's no more active river sediment supply. So this is an important component. This longshore aspect is very, very important in terms of overall delta morphology and morphodynamics over time. And of course, it's the same thing also goes for the sand aspects. Coastal sand sequestering in river mouth sectors of large deltas is probably quite common, where you've got differential wave refraction generated by these multiple mouths. So this is a way actually of controlling the longshore sediment transport, of containing the sand within these river mouth areas, as we've seen for the Mekong, as we've seen for the Irrawaddy. And of course, this is the case of the Kuakata Peninsula at the mouths of the Ganges Brahmaputra. We've got beach ridges in this blue rectangle, and of course, we've got muddy deposits on the western side. So note 3, bidirectional drift induced by distributary mouths or by pronounced longshore variations, which can be caused by lobe protrusions, for instance, can, in the case of wave-generated deltas, generate sequestering of bed load within the confines of the delta shoreline. This is commonly expressed as spits, flanking spits. So if we look at these examples, we can see the Mangoki, for instance, you've got this bidirectional drift systems in some areas. Same thing with the Danube reworked lobe. My colleagues in Romania are working actually on this system. And you've got the Sakhalin barrier, of course, which is trapped by refraction of the end and counter drift. Same thing with the Ebro Delta. There's drift from the mouths, but then there's trapping within the flanking spits because you've got counter drift. And as you can see from the inset at the bottom left there, you get erosion at the mouth, you get massive accretion at the flanks of these spits. Same thing goes for the Rhone Delta, where you've got a very, very important accretion at the mouth, the main mouth, and the secondary mouth is being reworked, so much less discharge coming through this reworked lobe. And you get this bidirectional drift system that lead to containment of sand within the deltaic frame itself. There's not loss of the longshore here, but this in other areas, of course, it's very important. Smaller deltas, it's very important having this longshore drift from the delta mouth to adjacent coasts. The same thing goes for the Volta Delta here, where you've got a massive speed, unidirectional longshore drift, but there the erosion is being caused by a drift pulse. Sediment is trapped at the tip of the spit, and there's no more sediment for the Bight of Benin coast further south, so there's erosion which feeds this coast, but that's another system. So it just shows you how the dynamics along delta mouths can mediate sediment transport to adjacent sectors or imbalances in sediment transport as well. A few additional noteworthy points, of course, increasing use of all types of high resolution data from satellite imagery. This is permeating all aspects of delta studies, from the shoreline changes to mud advection at a large scale, for instance. I would like to insist, of course, on the unique nature of the Amazon mud dispersal system, which is a wave-driven system along the Guiana's coast, and still a number of issues to be resolved regarding the source area and the terminus area of this large delta. And of course, insist also on the common dichotomy of a longshore sediment organization in some deltas with high sediment supply. It means, of course, there's some semblance of segregation that's dependent on energy gradients between bed load. You've got these sandy shorelines associated with distributary mouths, and off this distributary mouths, away from them, you get sandy suspended load, downdrift of the mouths. I would also like to insist on the fact that fine-scale field studies yield insight on patterns of longshore sediment transport in deltas, as we've shown for both for the Amazon system, but also for the Mekong and the Irrawaddy system. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Edward. This is a fantastic, wonderful talk. Give us overview all the way from Amazon, Mekong, Irrawaddy, and the Niger, and even Ganges Brahmaputra. Okay, if you have any question, please raise your hand. I will unmute yourself. So say Daidu and Professor Fan. So Daidu, please go ahead. Do you want to read your question? Speak out your question. Yeah, go ahead. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Edward, for your great talk. You show us quite a wide, very diverse, different kind of longshore sediment system, and I quite interested in moving muddy bank along the Guiana coast. I have a short question for you. How about the change in configuration and total volume of each muddy bank when they're moving downstream? This is first question. And another one, there's a lot of small river flow into Guiana coast, and considering strong longshore sediment transport and huge sediment supply, what kind of mechanism to keep this small estuary open along the coast? Thank you.
Yes, can you just repeat the first question on the mud banks? I didn't quite get that.
Okay. Edward,
you can. I already typed there. You can.
Okay. You click in the chat. Edward, can you?
Okay, right. Let me see. I'm not very familiar with this system.
Just in the bottom, the chat. You can click the chat. Right.
Okay, shall I just take away my slide or not?
No, that's fine. That's fine. You can leave it here. You can back
at the bottom.
Chat. I cannot see.
I can repeat. Yeah.
Okay.
How about the change? How about the configuration change and total volume of each muddy bank when they move downstream? The shape of the muddy bank.
Oh, yes. I get you. Yes. Of course, the mud banks, basically, they're elongated features because you've got the shoreline and you've got the wave forcing, of course. But this elongation, of course, depends on the shoreline morphology. You've got areas where the wave angle, of course, relative to the coast is higher or lower. And as a function of this, of course, you get the trailing edge that catches up more or less with the leading edge, because these stretch over several kilometers, of course, with change in shoreline orientations. So this sometimes you get a thickening of the mud bank, a shortening as well, and it becomes wider somehow because sediment is because of mud budget continuity. So this is basically depends on orientation of the shoreline relative to waves. And of course, you can have changes in wave energy especially with El Nino and La Nina. So these are basically important changes in wave energy as well. As far as the river mouths are concerned, well, these are not all of them are small rivers. You've got quite some big rivers here, and the seasonal discharge can be quite high. So what happens generally in the rainy season, of course, is that you get flushing of mud from the Amazon, but in the low discharge season, mud re-enters the system as well. If you get accommodation space within the estuarine areas, then mud can be trapped, which is not the case with the Moroni, on which we are actually working at the present time. The very, very small accommodation space for mud. So the dynamics is actually moving Amazon mud up and down. But this, of course, can vary depending on the bank or interbank phases. When you get interbank phases, there's less mud intruding into the deltas. There's more mud intruding when you are in the bank phase. But these are not small rivers. Some of them are quite big. They supply a lot of sand. And these sands, of course, build out cheniers that are inscribed within the progradational muddy plain of the Guianas. So big cheniers there as well.
Very good.
Yes.
Thank you.
So Edward, a quick question before I give to Tom Bjork. So how fast of that mud bank migrate, as you mentioned, a longshore migrate? It's very, very slow, or is notable change?
It's the if you look at the global pattern, the migration rate goes from what, 1.5, 2 kilometers a year up to exceptionally 4.5 kilometers a year.
Wow.
But that's exceptional. Basically, it's within the range of up to 2.5 kilometers a year, not more. So this is very, very slow rate because you need to bring this mud along.
Yeah.
So the whole system takes about, a mud bank takes about 450 years to go from the Amazon to the Orinoco Delta.
Okay.
So very, very slow migration process.
Okay, very good. Tom.
Thanks, Paul. Edward, very, very good talk. This is another wonderful talk added to Paul's compilation library here that will be valuable for many years to come. The quick question is, I'm very intrigued by this appearance and disappearance of these mangrove areas along the dispersal pathway. And I don't know if anyone's looking at this, but if they're not, it may be something you and I may want to chat about. But I'm curious to know, because of the importance of sequestration by mangroves, as you mentioned, with carbon cycling, if you're having this disappearance and appearance, has anyone looked at the relative time period and efficiency of the burial and burn cycle? Because it sounds like there may be this flipping of burial and burn, and I'm just curious how complete that is, or if anyone's looked at the cyclicity of that.
Very, very good point, Tom. This is a very, very interesting aspect. We've basically worked on the sediment dynamics, but we've got colleagues and friends in Toulouse, especially Romain Walker, and Romain is working on this carbon sequestration aspects and release as well. So this is a very, very interesting point, because you've got this massive amount of organic material that's there. These plants are uprooted, they're transported along shore. I mean, they must be ending somewhere. I think they're ending in the Orinoco system because they're actually comminuted, they're destroyed in the transport process, but they're always there within the mud bank system as well. So very, very interesting questions on the outcome. Some of this mud, of course, is trapped within the prograding within the prograding Guiana's coastal plain. So there's trapping within this system, but the bulk of the mangrove system probably, especially at the present time, is moving alongshore with this system, being co-minuted and this is actually a large organic carbon supply, supplementary supply as well, in relation to the inorganic components of the mud itself. But this is a very interesting question, and maybe we can discuss this further with my colleagues in French Guiana, who are actually very, very interested in these questions. Yes, good, very good point. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Next is E. Guzman. So, what's your full name? I'm sorry, I didn't catch.
Eric Grossman.
Eric, yes, Eric, yeah. Go ahead.
Great talk. Thank you so much. I know these processes in such mud-rich areas are so complex to understand even today, but I was wondering, with such enormous shoreline variability that you showed along the Guyana shore, do you have a sense, or is anyone working on trying to assess how they will respond to sea level rise?
Thank you, Eric.
Not to get
good.
super detailed.
Very good question. Very good question indeed. We've started looking at this sea level aspect. I think it's really very important because you've also got subsidence along the coast. But the response of these shorelines at the present time, of course, is much more dynamic at these short-term scales to these processes that are going on. I mean, it's you get 200 meters of retreat in a year, and we believe, of course, that it's very important maintaining the mangroves. So in French Guiana, mangroves cannot be cut down. It's a natural process of erosion and accretion. But the way this sediment will be recycled, probably towards the onshore in terms of sea level rise, is a very interesting question. We believe basically the starting point, basically the starting hypothesis we've got is we've got enough mud transiting along the shore to counter sea level rise in this area. But of course, it depends on how this mud is dispatched along the coast in the cross-shore frame as well. That's very important because the cross-shore frame determines the elevation. So these are aspects we've started looking at. Indeed, yes, very important point. But there are so many big questions on this mud dispersal system.
Okay, Edward, I think Daniel have a question. Daniel, could you unmute yourself? Go ahead, directly ask the question.
Yeah, hi Edward, very nice. Wondering, can you be sure that the mud banks in Guyana and so, are they really moved by the waves, or could it also be the wind-driven currents? It seems a rather large-scale thing for waves to move.
Well, thank you, Daniel. That's a good point. Of course, when we talk about the wave, I think the wave is the dominant moving mechanism here, because the wave energy is there permanently. Of course, you get wind forcing during the wet season as well. But basically, the observations we've carried out on mud streaming along this coast are related to really massive wave energy dissipation, very small amounts moving from the side. There's always this erosion front that's exposed to high energy waves. So you always get at the back, you actually have an erosional front with cliffs within the mud frame. And these are hit by the waves, of course. The sediment is advected by currents along the coast, generated by the waves, of course, but also by wind stress. And these move towards the front of the system. Dissipation is very rapid, but as long as you get this small front of wave energy dissipation, it contributes to sediment moving along shore. Of course, there's wind forcing as well, but the main element here moving sediment along the coast is mud banks along the coast. They're wave driven, basically.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Edward. We have a couple more questions from the YouTube live channel over there. So okay. Let me see. I'll read a question for you. The first one is from Emily Paskowski. And Emily asked the question is, hey, Edward, I have a question regarding the work on the Amazon. Do you know how the dynamics stability of the mud banks respond to the anthropogenic activity in the Amazon basin? So,
yes, interesting question, because we've always tended to consider that this mud bank system is way beyond anthropogenic influences. I mean, there's so much mud moving along shore. But when you look at the things in more detail, of course, we're not sure what's coming from the mouths of the Amazon, how that is influenced by changes in dams. Basically, the Amazon is not that influenced at the present stage. And we know from the talk of the colleague last week, there's a lot of storage, of course, within the Amazon. But in countries like Suriname and especially Guyana, there has been tampering of the system, basically the mangrove system. The mangrove system is what protects. Of course, the mud banks protect as well. But if you start tampering with the mangrove system, which stabilizes the seafront in these urbanized areas, of course, then you start having a system where there's no more protection from waves when the mud banks move along shore. So when the mud banks move along shore, there's no more protection. And the big problem, of course, is mangrove regeneration is very, very difficult when you start rendering the coast harder with dikes and especially these seawalls in Guyana. So there's a big problem. They're very, very reflective, and there's very, very strong liquefaction of mud, of course, even with the mud banks when you start having this regime. So mangroves are essential actually in terms of protecting the coast, because they dissipate actually the bulk of the wave energy, and they're there, they can regenerate very, very rapidly under natural conditions. But when you start tampering with the system, as we saw in Guyana, for instance, then you start having more fluid mangrove mud bank migration, less protection of the coast, of course, and these bring in problems for the development problems. I mean, Guyana cannot afford, for instance, to keep up these dikes. I mean, they pump all the national wealth in terms of just maintenance. So there's a big problem. So there's a new effort to replant mangroves, but it's really, it's unfortunate. I mean, it's very sad having to pay millions of dollars to replant mangroves when they were there naturally. So.
Very interesting. Hey, Edward, another quick question. You know, we know the big fires the last couple of years over the Amazon basin. Do you think it's possible over that mud belt or mud bank, we see that kind of burning carbon? You know, did you able to detect that kind of a signal? I have no idea. Maybe Tom.
That's a good point, but we've got the temporal scale here, because when you have burning in the Amazon, then the time scale of sediment transfer and carbon transfer to the coast is really quite long. It's really quite long. Because you get storage in these in the Amazon basin. So in the short term, not really, but maybe the mud banks have a signature of longer term past fires and carbon dispersal within this system. There's so many interesting things to be done with these mud banks, especially in terms of the geochemistry. I mean, there was some initial work, very, very interesting work by Mead Allison on the geochemical aspects. And of course, there was some other work as well on subsequently on the fact that it's a huge biogeochemical reactor. This was done by Bob Aller. So there's very, very interesting work still to be done. I mean, Bob is still involved in work on this mud bank system. So there's still things to be done here. We've basically been working, because the permanent team in French Guiana is basically composed of geomorphologists. We've basically been looking at the process aspect and not so much at the geochemical aspects. But these are things that need to be developed.
Sure. So hopefully this webinar series, we can stimulate or nourish more that kind of cross-discipline idea. Even the numerical modeling, I know Daniel is a big expert. So over the Amazon sediment dispersal, there's not so many numerical modeling to tell us how much exactly, how fast, the accumulation rate or all the way to the Orinoco. There's still lots of work we need to do. And
yes, we've got a colleague working with us on this modeling aspect of flows.
Now,
but basically, what we've been looking at is the smaller scale of the estuaries, but the sediment moving in and out of the estuaries. But we also need to integrate the larger scale, the longshore scale of the mud banks. This is quite a big question, really. I mean, it's important. But I think the modeling component, I think, is very important. We may start with waves, but then we need to look at other types of flows as well, especially wind, as Daniel was saying. This can be quite important as well. But there's a lot of energy being spent there on these shores.
Okay, Edward, I know you have to leave for your vacation, but there's two more questions. Maybe you can answer briefly. Okay. So first one is from Dada. You know, he's from
Dada, nice chap.
Niger, the Niger Delta, and he said, Edward, can you tell us the present status of those deltas, whether prograding or retrograding? So I think this is a very general question, but
yeah. Well, the Niger Delta?
I guess he asked maybe also other delta. We know Mekong,
Oh, okay.
Irrawaddy, and they
Yeah.
are all kind of, retrograding, kind
Yes.
of retreating.
Yeah.
But how about Niger?
Yes, the Irrawaddy is retreating, of course. The Mekong is still progressing, but very, very slightly. In fact, over the last 15, 20 years, you can actually see a downward trend at the mouths of the Irrawaddy. The Niger, I'm not sure. I think Olusegun Dada, who's a very nice chap working on the Niger Delta, probably knows this delta much more than I do. And we've talked about this. This is something we can work on, of course, with Dada, on the overall trends along the Niger Delta, but also the morphodynamics, because it's interesting looking at the muddy coast, for instance. Why is that patch there in the northwest corner on this high sand supply coast muddy, for instance? I mean, these are quite interesting questions we can look at in the future. But many of these deltas, of course, are retreating. I mean, let's be clear on this. There's a big problem of delta retreat globally. I mean, you can have a global image that there's accretion of deltas, but when you look at these big individual deltas, many of them are actually undergoing a downward trend.
Okay, we have another question. So the last question, hopefully this from Kavasi Apening Adado. He says, thank you for your talk. With the dynamic in the Walter Delta, do you know
Yes.
a change in the near future? If
Yes.
you know, you can make a quick comments.
Yes. Hello, Kwesi. It's a pleasure listening to your question as well. And yes, of course, very, very interesting system. It's not clear what's happening at the mouths of the Volta Delta, but there's some recent work we've done with a Danish colleague, Troels Agard, that shows that the Keta spit is fairly old. It's much older than we thought initially. And there's what's interesting with this system, I think, is that there's still this chronic erosion in the Keta area, and which is quite natural. But there are still so many things to be learned about the Volta Delta. And I'm sure the work that's being done by Kwesi is very, very important in this regard. So there could be scope for collaboration as well with Kwesi on the Volta Delta. A good question, Kwesi.
Okay, great. Thank you, Edward. I know your wife is waiting, your family waiting for you, and you supposed to leave 7 minutes ago. But thank you very much for this wonderful overview and a wonderful talk. And so once again, my friend, so next Wednesday, we have a talk from Albert, talk about the global, particularly the high mountain river, the sediment flux change. And also we have Annie from Free University of Berlin talk about the active margin. You know, so far we have many talk about large river in the passive margin, like Amazon, like the Mekong, the Yangtze. But the next Friday, Annie will talk about, in the South America Andes Mountain, the active margin, all the way to that subduction. That should be another very interesting talk. So please mark your calendar coming back next Wednesday and the next Friday. So I think we can stop here. So
thank you very much.
yeah. So Ed